So I've been asked to do the difficult job, which is applying the German cannabis model to the UK. And before we start, it doesn't quite fit. So if you'd like to leave now, the exits are there, and behind me. However, I will canter through this. It's mostly words and clicks. So thank you for the world-class business leaders for inviting me to speak on behalf of the UK cannabis industry. I've told you all of that. Why does Germany matter now? It's not created a fully commercial adult use cannabis market. There are no North American-style dispensaries, but instead Germany has created a constrained hybrid system built around personal cultivation, non-commercial cultivation associations, and expanded access to medical cannabis. And that makes it especially relevant to the UK, because the UK market is unlikely to move directly from prohibition to a fully commercial cannabis market. Any reform here would most certainly be cautious, politically sensitive, and framed around public health, enforcement, and regulatory control. So Germany gives us a live European case study. It shows what happens when a state tries to reduce criminalization without fully opening a commercial market. It also shows the risks of a partial reform, supply bottlenecks, and medical market distortion, enforcement complexity, and a persistence of illicit supply. For the UK, Germany's not a template, it's a stress test. So, what Germany actually legalized and what it did not? Well, Germany did not legalize cannabis in the way people often imagine. It didn't create a North American-style adult use market. There are no licensed recreational dispensaries, no open commercial retail model, and no normal consumer cannabis market. What Germany legalized was narrower. Adults can possess limited quantities, they can grow a small quantity of plants at home, they can join a non-commercial cultivation associations, and medical cannabis sits alongside this under a separate framework. The distinction is absolutely central to this presentation. So, because we understand that Germany has legalized access without fully legalizing supply, we start to understand the pressure points. If people can't access enough cannabis through lawful non-commercial routes, then demand doesn't disappear, it moves somewhere else. So it might be into the home grow section, informal supply, the medical section, or the illicit market. So Germany should not be described as a commercial cannabis market. Where are we on this? Oh, yeah, right. Okay. So what is better understood to be a controlled access model. And that's why projecting it into the UK requires gap analysis rather than a simple comparison, because they're not comparative in that sense. So, Germany's 3 access routes. Yep, I think I'm there. The first is personal cultivation. Adults can grow up to 3 plants for their own use, and that gives some people a lawful route out of the illicit market. But it's not a realistic supply solution for everyone. Many consumers don't have the space, skills, privacy, time, or inclination to cultivate their own cannabis. The second route is the cultivation association model. These are non-commercial, member-based associations. They can cultivate and distribute cannabis to members within strict limits, but they're not dispensaries and they're not designed to operate as mainstream consumer markets. That's very important because it limits commercialization, but it also limits scale, convenience, and consumer choice. Right, where are we on this? Okay. The third route is medical cannabis. This sits outside the adult use framework, but in practice it becomes part of the access picture. When non-medical access is constrained, medical access can expand rapidly, particularly where patients and consumers see it as the most reliable, lawful route. So, Germany created legal routes, but not a unified legal market. And that distinction will matter when we try to project Germany, the German model into the UK. Right. So, the early evidence from Germany is best read as a mixed picture. It's not credible to say that the model has failed simply because the illicit market has not disappeared. No serious reform removes the illicit supply overnight, particularly when commercial adult use retail has not been introduced. Right. It's also not credible to say that the model has solved the problem. Germany has reduced the criminalization of adult consumers and created lawful routes through some home cultivation associations and medical access. However, those routes don't yet amount to a functioning regulated supply system. So, the key figure here is the gap between total demand and lawful non-commercial supply. Now, I'm going by reported figures, but I understand from this room that there are others. Reported estimates put German cannabis demand in 2024 at between 620 and 823 tons. Medical cannabis appears to cover a meaningful share of that demand, but cultivation associations are reported to contribute less than 0.1%, and that tells us something important. The association model may be legally significant, but it's not yet a mass market supply mechanism. So, Germany's early outcomes point to displacement. Demand moves across routes: home grow, social sharing, medical prescribing, informal supply, and the illicit market. And this is where the UK lesson begins. If we design reform without thinking about supply, affordability, and access, which are all key topics that we've all discussed here over the last couple of days, the market does not become controlled. It becomes fragmented. Right. Yep. So the German medical cannabis market is now central to understanding the whole reform. In theory, medical cannabis, adult use cannabis, sits in a separate legal categories. In practice, in real world, they interact. Germany has legalized possession, home cultivation, and associations, but it's not created a normal commercial adult use supply chain. That means that patients and consumers looking for reliable, tested, lawful access may find the medical route more practical than the non-medical route. And this is where the distortion starts appearing. Medical cannabis imports have grown sharply, as we've seen, and the German government has already expressed concern about online prescribing and mail order access. That doesn't mean that the medical patients are not legitimate. It means that a constrained adult use system can place additional pressure on the medical framework. For the UK, this is highly relevant. The UK already has private medical cannabis market, telemedicine, and affordability, yet electronic prescribing is not yet available. But it doesn't have Germany's broader non-medical routes. So if the UK tried to introduce partial reform without designing supply properly, we could see a similar pressure on medical access, with medical cannabis becoming a proxy for a broader access problem. That's not a reason to restrict patients. It's a reason to design the system honestly. To understand the UK gap, we need to start with the baseline. The UK remains a prohibition model for adult cannabis use. Possession, supply, and production remain criminal offences. Home cultivation is also criminalised. There is no lawful route equivalent to Germany's personal cultivation allowance, and there is no equivalent to the German cultivation association model whatsoever. Medical cannabis is the exception. Since November 2028, and it was my MP, Sir Mike Penning, who got it through Parliament, bless him, we have now a medical use by specialist doctors. However, access is still very narrow, especially through the NHS. In practice, most patients' access is through the private sector, which creates an affordability issue. Now, some of you in the room might know this and others may not, but the combustion of even medical cannabis goes against the prescribed administration of that medicine, thus changing the status of cannabis, even if you are a cannabis patient, from a medicine to an illegally possessed drug. So we're operating on the prohibition side of the fence. And that matters for the comparison because Germany has created lawful non-medical routes for people who use cannabis. The UK has not. So the UK doesn't have the same access architecture. It has criminalization on one side and specialist medical prescribing on the other, with very little in between. And that's also why the UK self-medication issue is important. People who use cannabis, perhaps for symptom relief, we don't know at this point, or who cannot access or afford a private clinic, and they don't have a German-style route into lawful personal cultivation or association membership, they will remain exposed to the illicit market and the criminal justice system. So, when we project the German model into the UK, we're not projecting into a similar system, we're projecting into a binary system. Illegal adult use versus restricted medical access. So, where do Germany and the UK fundamentally diverge? So this is the comparator here. Germany and the UK are not just different because Germany has legalized more cannabis activity, they are different because Germany has created lawful, non-medical access routes, whilst the UK has not. In Germany, an adult can possess limited amounts, cultivate a few number of plants at home, and join a non-commercial cultivation association. That doesn't create a full market, and it doesn't eliminate illicit supply, but it does create lawful routes outside the medical system. Okay. So, in the UK, adult use cannabis remains criminalized. Home cultivation remains criminalized. There is no legal equivalent to a German cultivation association. Medical cannabis exists, but it's not a general access route. It's a specialist prescribing route, and in practice, access is still heavily shaped by cost, clinical willingness, and private clinic availability. So, Germany's problem is that lawful access exists, but supply is fragmented and constrained. The UK's problem is there's a legal medical route, but no lawful route for non-medical users, including people who self-medicate and cannot afford to access formal, private medical care and supply. And that matters because if the UK tried to borrow from Germany, it would be adding a model into a similar foundation, not be adding a model into a similar foundation. It would be inserting a partial access model into a much more binary system. And that creates different risks and different opportunities. If we project the German model into the UK, there are likely outcomes. The first likely outcome is a reduction in criminalization for some adult consumers. Limited possession thresholds and a home cultivation allowance would immediately change the relationship between ordinary users and the criminal justice system. The second likely outcome is that some self-medicating adults would gain a lawful route outside private medical clinics. This is particularly important in the UK because there is currently no route for people who are using cannabis for symptom relief and cannot access or afford formal medical cannabis other than the illicit market. The third likely outcome is that the illicit supply will remain significant. Germany knows that lawful access doesn't automatically mean lawful supply. If the UK had adopted possession, home grow, and non-commercial associations without further supply design, the illicit market would not disappear. The fourth likely outcome is pressure on the medical system. If adult use supply remains constrained, the private medical route would become even more important as the most reliable lawful pathway. And that raises questions about prescribing standards, data protection, affordability, telemedicine, pharmacy capacity, and patient protection. The fifth outcome is implementation complexity. Police, regulators, local authorities, clinicians, and the entire industry would all need clear rules. Without that, partial reform risks creating confusion rather than control. So, the likely UK outcome is not a clean transition from prohibition to regulation. It's a shift from a criminal justice problem to a system design problem. Right. So we've done that one. So if copied badly, the argument is copying Germany badly is risky. The first risk is supply failure. If people are allowed to possess cannabis, but there's no reliable lawful supply route, the illicit market remains embedded, and they're very fast and reactionary. Germany has partially addressed this through some home-grow and cultivation associations, but early evidence suggests associations are not yet supplying at any meaningful scale. The second risk is medical distortion. If adult use supply is constrained, medical cannabis can become the practical legal route that may expand patient access, but it also can create political concern, clinical pressure, and questions about prescribing governance. The third risk is enforcement confusion. Police needs rules that are clear, workable, and proportionate. If the UK introduced possession thresholds, home grow or associations without operational clarity, enforcement would become entirely inconsistent. It's bad enough at the moment. The fourth risk is patient inequity. This is particularly relevant in the UK. People who can afford private medical cannabis may access a lawful supply, whilst people who cannot remain criminalised, even when they're using cannabis for health-related reasons. The fifth risk is the illicit market resilience. If lawful routes are slow, expensive, too limited, or difficult to access, people will continue to use illegal supply. And the sixth risk is industry uncertainty. And don't we hate it when we're uncertain? The UK cannabis sector needs clarity before investment. A vague or politically reactive model could leave responsible operators unable to plan, whilst less compliant actors can move much faster. So the core point's simple. Bad reform doesn't end prohibition. It moves the pressure into medicine, policing, inequality, and market confusion. So, and this is where UK opportunity becomes clear. Germany shouldn't be treated as a model to copy, but as a model to learn from. If the UK adapted the useful parts properly, there would be a genuine opportunity to design a more coherent cannabis framework than the one we have now. On supply, the opportunity is to create controlled access routes that reduce reliance on the illicit supply. That doesn't necessarily mean jumping straight into full commercial adult use market. I think it's highly unlikely it would, but it would mean carefully designed pilots, stronger medical access, lawful personal cultivation, community-based models, pharmacy-linked routes, and other regulated pathways. On law, the opportunity is to do with proportionality. At the moment, UK cannabis law treats adult possession, home cultivation, and supply through a criminal justice lens. A reformed model could separate low risk adult activity from serious criminality, exploitation, youth supply, and organized crime. On health, the opportunity is to stop pretending that self-medication or people using lawful access doesn't exist. The UK already has people using cannabis for symptom relief and or because they can afford a private clinic outside the legal medical system. A better model would be to create a bridge between self-medication, clinical support, patient education, harm reduction, and affordability. On policing, there's an opportunity to refocus resources at last. Rather than criminalizing simple possession, police could focus more clearly on dangerous supply, youth access, and exploitation, impaired driving, and organized crime. On market access, the UK has significant capability already. We have clinics, prescribers, pharmacies, licensed producers, distributors, testing services, compliance specialists, patient groups, and industry bodies. What's missing is a clear pathway for lawful non-medical participation and a better integrated medical framework than the one we have. So the opportunity is not cannabis liberalization for its own sake. The opportunity is better control, better health oversight, better legal proportionality, and more credible regulated sector. Yeah. So this is the last series of slides. The strategic question for the UK sector is not simply how to campaign for reform, it's how to become a credible partner in designing it. The first recommendation is to lead with evidence, not ideology. Germany gives us a valuable case study in this, but it shouldn't be used as a slogan. The useful lesson is not that Germany legalized cannabis. The useful lesson is that partial reform creates specific operational challenges around supply, medical access, enforcement, and market structure. The second recommendation is to protect medical cannabis. The adult use debate must not undermine patients and health. The UK already has a fragile medical framework, and access is still limited by cost, clinical caution, and restricted National Health Service prescribing, NHS prescribing. Any broader reform should strengthen patient access and not create more stigma and political backlash. The third recommendation is to build a credible supply framework, please. This is the lesson that Germany makes absolutely unavoidable. If lawful possession is introduced without lawful supply, the illicit market remains central. The sector should be ready to propose options that are proportionate, testable, and aligned with the UK regulatory culture. The fourth recommendation is to design for enforcement and public confidence. Reform will fail politically if the police, local council, regulators, and the public don't understand the rules. Clear thresholds, licensing standards, diversion controls, youth protection, and product safety requirements need to be built in right from the start. The fifth recommendation is to create a compliant market access pathway. Responsible businesses need clarity, and that means licensing, testing, professional training, pharmacy standards, cultivation controls, data reporting, and consumer and patient education. The sector's strongest position is not to ask for deregulation. Our sector should be asking that regulation can work better than prohibition. The UK should not copy Germany. Germany is operating within its own constitutional, political, healthcare, and European legal context. Its model reflects those constraints. It allows limited possession, home cultivation, and non-commercial association, but stops short of commercial adult use retail. And that makes Germany extremely useful as a case study, but dangerous as a template. The UK starts from a different baseline. Adult use remains prohibited, home cultivation is criminalized, and there's no association model. Medical cannabis is legal, but access is narrow, specialist-led, and often dependent on private affordability. So the lesson for the UK is not to simply adopt the German possession limits or copy the association model. The lesson is to design reform as a whole system. Legal access must be matched by lawful supply. Just checking I'm not there. Yeah. Lawful supply. Medical cannabis must be protected rather than turned into political pressure. Public health needs to be central from the start. Police need rules that are clear enough to apply, and responsible businesses need a compliant route into the market rather than a vacuum filled by illicit supply or indeed uncertainty. Germany shows that reform can happen in a cautious European context, but it also shows that partial reform creates new pressures when supply, health, enforcement, and market access are not fully aligned. The UK opportunity is to take those lessons and design something better suited to our own legal, clinical, and regulatory reality. That is, I think, all from me.
Thank you, Marika.
Thank you all very much for your patience and indulgence.